Time to listen to me whine about nothing and everything all at once. I am one of those.
Hi, I'm anarchist prisoner Sean Swain. Welcome to episode 7 of the Anarcology podcast, where we finally get to the central topic, freedom. It's my favorite topic to think about and to talk about, and I hope you're as currently caffeinated as I am and as excited about this as I am. But before we get to freedom, a quick recap. We've already discussed the major institutions of our culture that serve as sites for inflicting trauma and either opposing or constricting freedom. A series of episodes that I hope have inspired you to rethink your relationship to these institutions and view them in a new way, a way that serves your ultimate liberation. At least I hope. And so we get to the topic of freedom. I can't think of anything more important for a life lived to its fullest than freedom. I think freedom is the most important condition for us to live in, that we have the greatest possibility for becoming our best selves when all the barriers and all the limitations are lifted away and we can just be who we are. People constantly talk about freedom. We complain when someone infringes upon our freedom. We sometimes fight and die for freedom. We have flags and slogans about freedom. Freedom or death. Live free or die. The United States calls itself the land of the free. So no doubt, if you were to take a survey with a random group of people, I don't know, maybe 100, maybe 1,000, maybe even 1,000,000 people, and you ask them, do you value your freedom? I bet every single person responds with a resounding yes. Not one person will ever say, yeah, you know what? Freedom's really overrated. Give me some good old brutal repression. Nobody says that. So, in an age when it seems like nobody can agree with anybody about anything else, the only thing that every human on the planet can agree on is that we're all in favor of freedom, at least for ourselves, right? So what does this mean to be free? What is freedom? We all use the word, but are we meaning the same thing when we use it? Are we all talking about the same thing? I would suggest to you that maybe we're not always talking about the same thing. I've had this conversation with hundreds of people, maybe thousands. I ask them if they value freedom. To a person, every single one of them says they do. But my next question is, what is freedom? Not everybody answers that immediately. Some people will get their faces all screwed up, like they're thinking hard or else having a difficult bowel movement. It's the same face, you know. Humans look the same whether we're dropping a deuce or having a brilliant thought. So some people, I ask them, what's freedom? And they get that face. They're either thinking really hard or else they're trying to shit their pants. And I find this odd, that we can value a thing but not be able to describe it to someone else. We've got these big brains with a cerebral cortex that's all out of whack compared to the size of the rest of our gray matter, and we're masters of conceptual thought, but we can't define something we love. I like baseball. Ask me what it is, I'll tell you immediately. 9 players on the field, 1 player up the bat, bases in the shape of a diamond, large expanse of grass, umpires, and on and on. Ask me, what's sexual intercourse? My immediate response, genital friction. I mean, there's a bit more to it than that, and it's more complex than just rubbing your junk together like you want to start a cooking fire. But friction's going to be involved. And I don't have to screw my face up before I tell you about baseball or sex. You don't have to wonder from my expression, is Swain trying to shit his pants? No, I'm not. But thank you for asking. So it's kind of weird that some people think they value something but can't define it. It reminds me of a poll that asked people how many of the Ten Commandments they believed in, and an overwhelming number of responders said 10. But when they were asked what those commandments were, most people could only name 3. Me, personally, I'm a firm believer in 6 of them, but I won't even tell you which ones. So anyway, my point is that if you don't know what something is, you can't really value it. Other people give me an answer to the question, what's freedom? They'll say freedom is smoking a blunt when you want to, or going wherever you want, or drinking, or spending time with your family. Now, these answers aren't really describing freedom so much as they're describing the specific activities that each of these individual people would like to do if they were free. And that's not really telling me what freedom is. That's kind of like if I asked you what food was and you said a blooming onion at Outback Steakhouse. I mean, you're right, a blooming onion is ostensibly food, but so is the salad bar at Olive Garden, or the sliders at White Castle, or my mom's macaroni and cheese. All of those activities that people mention could really be freedom, but so could just about any other activity. Now, other people will begin listing things when I ask them that question. They'll say, oh, freedom is the freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, the freedom of speech, and so on. These are the liberties that governments recognize and permit. And so listing these might be somewhat instructive, I suppose. It's kind of like asking what ice cream is, and someone gives you a laundry list of all the flavors from Ben and Jerry's. That tells you about the different varieties of ice cream, but it doesn't really give you a clue about what the ice cream is itself. It doesn't tell you that ice cream is a frozen dairy product of a relatively soft consistency. You see what I mean? The best definition for freedom that I've ever heard, the one I suggest we adopt for anarcology, is by a guy named Ward Churchill. Ward Churchill is an activist and radical. He's a former professor, might still be one. He's an all-around intellectual badass, and he defined freedom like this. He said, freedom is the absence of external regulation. Now I'm going to repeat that for dramatic effect. Freedom is the absence of external regulation. You see how simple and how elegant that is? Whatever your thoughts on freedom, they fit into that 5-word definition, the absence of external regulation. You know what? I should have just plagiarized the fucking thing. I shouldn't have even told you anything about Ward Churchill. If I hadn't mentioned him at all, you'd be sitting there right now with your wig blown back. You'd be like, wow, Swain's a goddamn brilliant guy. He deserves a fucking Nobel Peace Prize for that shit. Maybe we should just edit out Ward Churchill, and I can just steal his thunder. I don't know. Let's put a pin in that and circle back later. Let's get back to freedom. The absence of external regulation. Where there's no external regulation, I'm free. Pretty simple. I can eat Pop-Tarts for breakfast. Why? Because mom's not home, and no one's there to demand that I eat those bran flakes. You see? Absence of external regulation. How many cookies can you take from the cookie jar? As many as you want. There's no cookie cop standing there with a whistle, eyeing you from behind his reflective sunglasses. No cookie cop. The absence of external regulation. Where we don't have external regulation, we're free to do as we please. We're free to choose. Freedom, the absence of external regulation. But the opposite's also true. Think about this. If freedom is the absence of external regulation, then wherever you have external regulation, you have also an absence of freedom. So where you have freedom, you don't have external regulation. And where you have external regulation, you don't have freedom. The two things can't exist in the same place at the same time. If we were going to try to get all intellectual about this and impress people, we'd say freedom and external regulation are mutually exclusive states. That means you can't be in both at the same time. You can't be rich and broke. You can't be clean and polluted. You can't be drunk and sober. You can't be free and externally regulated. They're opposites. So now, let's get all graphy with this. Hopefully, with the magic of the interweb, Bumblebee can duplicate the graph here. It's fairly simple, even if she can't. So I need you to imagine this. There's 2 points, okay? There's 2 big black dots connected by a horizontal line. Underneath one of those black dots, we have the word freedom. This is the point where you're free, the absence of external regulation. Now, to go down that line to the opposite end, the other big black dot, and we label that external regulation. This point represents a situation where every single element of your life is regulated. You're as unfree as you can possibly get. You have no freedom at all. It's the absolute absence of freedom. Okay? So we have those 2 extreme points, those 2 black dots, and they're connected by that line. Now, the line that connects the 2 of them, that's like the spectrum in between the 2 opposing forces. That horizontal line represents the interplay between freedom and external regulation. And I would suggest to you that we live our lives somewhere on that horizontal line. If perhaps you lived in Italy under Mussolini, you would be situated not far from that extreme point, external regulation, where there's no freedom at all. You'd be just to the side of that on that line. But if instead you live in Belgium or perhaps Canada, so-called liberal democracies, you might be situated on the line not that far from the other extreme point, freedom. So what we're working with on this graph is a kind of sliding scale, right? The relative amount of how much external regulation you're experiencing, the relative amount of unfreedom. I think this is a healthy way to think about freedom, which is the absence of external regulation. But as we look at this graph, let's not forget, there's only one point where you're free, where there's an absence of external regulation, and that's freedom, that one big black dot. Anywhere else, if you're on that horizontal line, you're experiencing varying degrees of non-freedom. Also, as we move along, I think we should probably point out, although this is something of a no-brainer, that wherever you have an external regulation, you have an external regulator. I mean, it kind of stands to reason that if you're subjected to external regulation, that there's someone or something that's doing that regulating, right? And it's not you. And it doesn't really matter who it is, or what their personal politics are, or what title they've given themselves. I mean, not for our purposes. For our purposes, all that matters is that they're telling you what to do. They're regulating you. They're rendering you unfree. So let's take something of a deeper dive into that, shall we? A deeper dive into external regulation and the external regulators. What is it we typically call something that externally regulates us? I mean, the one major thing that makes it a point to externally regulate us. In fact, it's the whole reason to exist for this thing, to regulate us. Typically, we call that regulator government, right? To govern is to regulate. Governing and regulating are the same thing. Governments regulate. Show me any government that isn't regulating, and I'll show you a failed state. Because it's the very reason for government's existence, to regulate, to govern. And again, it doesn't matter what kind of government we're talking about, or who it is that runs that government, or whether they're nice people who mean well. None of that really matters. That's sort of beyond our discussion. For our purposes here, just to be clear, Hitler, Mussolini, JFK, King Charles, they're all in the same box. They're all in the same category. Government. Governments regulate. So if we go back to that graph, we have freedom on one point, and then a line, and then we have external regulation on the other point. Freedom, as we already know, is the absence of external regulation. So let's go to the other end, external regulation, because we know that external regulation requires an external regulator. And we know that the principal external regulator is government. So perhaps below external regulation on the graph, just for clarity, we should add in, maybe even in parentheses, government. Because government regulates. And because we've now gotten more specific on that end of the graph, maybe we should indicate the change on the other end also. Maybe underneath the word freedom, we should put in parentheses, absence of government. This is important, I think. And it's important because it's honest. I'm not trying to convert you or recruit you or get you to tip over cop cars or light dumpsters on fire. We're talking about freedom, an analytical study of what freedom is, and that's all. And so if you value freedom, and I hope you do, then you have to follow where the logic progression takes you. That's all we're doing. Freedom is the absence of external regulation. Governments externally regulate, and so freedom is the absence of government, among other things. I know this conclusion will make a lot of people uncomfortable. I get it. The truth hurts. But the truth hurts because we live in a world where we have a lie for everything, including what freedom is. So, returning to our graph, freedom and government are opposing forces, opposites. Wherever you find freedom, you have an absence of government. And wherever you find government, you have an absence of freedom. You're either free or you're regulated. You're either free or you're governed. You can't be free and governed. You can't be rich and broke, clean and polluted, drunk and sober, free and governed. You're one or the other. This is probably really hard to accept for folks who think government is the source of freedom, who think their government's the protector of freedom. How's that song go? I'm proud to be an American where at least I know I'm free. Yeah, Lee Greenwood's going to have to rethink that. Governments are never the sources of freedom. Some governments provide recognition of some freedoms, certain freedoms, but only to regulate those, to put limits on them, to control how we exercise them and how we think about them. Governments recognize rights so that government can decide the limits on those rights. In the absence of government, you're free. You decide what your rights are and how you exercise them and what the practical limitations of those rights are. You do. And that's freedom. The absence of external regulation, the absence of government. Now, there's a quick point that I want to make, and then we'll circle back to this. Fidel Castro, he's dead now, but he was the leader of Cuba. And when Castro was in charge of Cuba, do you know what nation had the highest literacy rate? Cuba. The nation with zero homelessness? Cuba. The most medical doctors per capita of any nation in the world? Cuba. The best nuclear medicine program in the world? Cuba. But you still didn't see Americans immigrating to Cuba. Americans would tell you, no matter how good it might be in Cuba, they don't have the freedoms we have. Freedom. So, relative comfort is immaterial if we're talking about freedom. But now, here, we're talking about freedom, real freedom. And the question confronts us whether we want the relative comforts by compromising freedom. Seems you might be finding yourself on the opposite side of an argument where you thought you were. Seems you might be thinking, well, I enjoy the relative comforts that governments provide, so maybe I'll just compromise my freedom a little. And you know, that's the same argument that would put you on a tractor tire inner tube floating from Miami to Havana at low tide. Just a thought. Now, no doubt some of you have gotten ahead of me, and you're staring at the graph and you're thinking, holy fuck, this asshole is trying to say I can't be free unless I topple the government, and that's just too daunting. I think I'll shut this shit off and go watch some cute cat videos. But hold on. First, you got that wrong. You don't have to topple your government to be free. You've actually got to topple all of them. It's more daunting than you thought it was. But second, before you turn away to the cute cat videos, there's something you need to consider so that you're making an informed choice in all of this. Freedom, the absence of external regulation. It occupies a single point. Everything else is a varying degree of non-freedom. But what do we call someone subjected to non-freedom? Either you're free or you're what? I would suggest that either you're free or you're a slave. As just a practical matter in our world, there are only two things you can be, either free or a slave. If you're not free, you are a slave. Now, look back at the graph. There are relative degrees of slavery. There certainly are. Only on the opposite end of the spectrum from freedom is every aspect of life totally and completely controlled. So, if you're on that graph, on that line somewhere between freedom and external regulation, you might be relatively fortunate in your slavery. You know, in the plantation South, not all slaves were field hands. Some worked inside the master's house. Maybe in our world, you're that kind of slave. You got a nice car, 401k, big screen TV. Maybe a lot of other slaves in our world would love to trade places with you. But let's not get confused. Let's not get it twisted. You're not free. You're comfortable. You're comfortable in your slavery, the same way house slaves were more comfortable than field hands on the plantation. But you're still a slave, and you're still not free. And those cute cat videos you wanted to watch instead of this shit won't get you any closer to freedom. Flat out. But they are cute. If Al Gore hadn't invented the internet, we would have missed millions of hours of cat videos. Anyway, if you're someone who doesn't mind compromising freedom for a little comfort, you should be watching cat videos. You're in the wrong lane right now. This podcast isn't for you. But for all of you who value your freedom, and I haven't scared you off yet, let's tie a few things together. Remember, we talked about potty training and the residual effects of feeling shame and guilt and humiliation. Those are powerful levers to install into slaves. And remember what we discussed about schooling, how we learn compliance, obedience, deference. All of those traits are really important in slaves. And we talked about capitalism, how it's robbery, reducing everyone to slavery, and how all the other institutions of culture have prepared you for your place within this slavery. We then deconstructed government, the right to rule, and how it's really a delusion, a false myth, something not really true, that the few really have no right to rule, and the many really have no duty to obey. So from potty training to today, we've all been reshaped by all of this, molded and honed into what we are. And perhaps if we didn't question it, we'd think this process was perfecting us. But now that we've taken a closer look, we can realize it has really disfigured us. And that's why all of this is trauma. All of it's pain. And so all this pain and trauma has been necessary to condition us to non-freedom, to reduce us to slavery. We've been subjected to long, slow processes of indoctrination and training to distort us, to convince us that our only choice is to compromise our freedom. And so we do. It convinces us that slavery is freedom, that this is all that there is. But look at the graph. We're not free. We're slaves. And all of our life experiences were intended to drive us to this. And that's why it hurts. Freedom, the absence of external regulation, the absence of government, I would suggest to you that this is our natural state. It's our home. It's where we were meant to be. It's what our design made us to inhabit. We belong there. Freedom is our natural habitat, and every fiber of our beings longs for the return to it. That's why our suicide rates are off the charts, why pharmaceutical companies are cranking out more and more drugs than ever to keep us compliant, why confused students experiencing excruciating hurt are shooting up their schools, why we drink and eat ourselves to death, why every day of our lives feels a little wrong and a little meaningless. And we sometimes want to run, but we don't know where to run to because it's someplace we've never been. Freedom. The symptoms that we collectively exhibit are the same symptoms we see in animals captured from the wild and placed into captivity. The same psychological and emotional unraveling. And we know from decades of studies that the more we are alienated and the more we're regulated and controlled and surveilled, the more intense is the pressure that drives us mad. So in this way, I would suggest that everything kind of converges right here on this point. Our physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health, all of that hinges upon us reclaiming our freedom. And until we do, we continue to get distorted. We continue to get toxified, traumatized, driven mad. Each of us, all of us. And collectively, we're kind of like the clock people from the previous episode, working so hard to maintain the vast machine, unknowingly collaborating to making a bomb. Look, I don't think I can overstate this. The people at the top of our pyramid scheme, the masterminds of the greatest swindle ever, have been streamlining and tweaking this cultural machine for about 8,000 years, generation after generation, century after century, to get you to forget who you are, and where you belong, and to get you to never so much as ask the questions that we're asking here about what freedom really is. So just to point this out, this is fucking dangerous. Thinking about freedom, viewing our world through a new lens, and recognizing that we've all been enslaved and it's fucking us up. You can't go around questioning ideas that are central to the operation of this larger swindle. You're not allowed to do that. There's examples of Copernicus and Galileo. They were both this close to being burned at the stake. One of them said the earth revolved around the sun. The other said the earth was round. Both of these revelations called into question whether the bastards at the top of the pyramid scheme knew what the fuck they were talking about. Now, I refer you back to a simple graph. Freedom, the absence of external regulation, the absence of government. I've got over 4,000 pages of FBI files. I've been confined for over 30 years without a legal conviction. I've been black-sided in place, sometimes for years at a time. They botched my assassination. Then after botching my assassination, they renditioned me. Illegal rendition. In a second effort to rendition me, they chopped off my finger. I'm now held at a supermax, even though I score out as a minimum security prisoner. A graph. Freedom. The absence of external regulation. The absence of government. And again, not to overstate this, but I would suggest to you that my observations here make Copernicus and Galileo look pretty fucking harmless. So just to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying that all of this response was a response to an observation that we're not free. Everything the fart goblins did to me were not a reaction to my observation. Reactions like this one are always a response to a question and not a statement. Proving to you that we're slaves and that we're not free isn't the danger that provoked the reaction. It's the question that naturally follows that observation. And that question is this: what the fuck are we going to do about it? So, yeah, thank you for listening. And thank you for watching. And if I'm still alive for the next episode, I hope you tune in. Episode 8 is How to Get Free Part 1. I'm anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Supermax in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're watching, you are the resistance.